Your Royal Highness, distinguished guests, colleagues, friends. It's wonderful, lovely to see you all here. In the room, in RSA House, in the great room, and also I know the many hundreds that are watching us online for tonight, our very special event, our Patrons lecture, one of the real highlights of the RSA calendar. And this year our Patrons lecture tackles an issue I'm sure you all agree of really profound importance. That is to say, social capital and social connections, that invisible web of relationships that shapes our lives, our opportunities, our communities, and our societies. And we're privileged to do so this evening with the world's leading voice on this very subject, Professor Robert Putnam. Now, life is never simple, especially when it comes to getting a flight across the Atlantic. Last week's Heathrow disruptions mean that Bob can't regrettably be here in person, but he's very much with us online, looking forward to delivering his lecture. Bob's pioneering work on this very topic is the theme, the golden thread that's running through all of the RSA's work this year. That includes our research on so-called revealing social capital, which was published today, and which shows, echoing the results for the US, just how powerful social connectedness, in particular between rich and poor, can be for shaping the life prospects and the well-being of the poorest people in society. It also underscores the importance of doing what we can to forge and nurture social cohesion and connectedness in the communities. And the RSA's Connected Places programme, working with places such as Ealing and Essex and across the pond in Baltimore, is about acting in place to nurture just that social capital. Now, the timing of tonight's event and our accompanying programme could hardly be better at a time when political polarization is that question on the rise, where inequality of opportunity is growing, when social division and isolation are on the rise. Tonight is how we do a better job of forging those cohesive communities and indeed societies. It's a real honour to have Her Royal Highness, the Princess Royal, our patron, with us this evening, someone who's not just a huge and long-time supporter of the RSA, but also a long-time and powerful advocate for the importance of social connection and social cohesion. So it's my privilege to welcome to the stage Her Royal Highness to introduce tonight's keynote speaker.
Well, good evening, my lords, ladies and gentlemen, and I'm delighted to be able to join you for this always enlightening event. But this, of course, is the RSA Patrons Lecture, and it is my pleasure to help slightly introduce your speaker, Robert D. Putnam. As we've just heard, that sadly the repercussions are still being felt after Heathrow's closure on Friday. I very nearly didn't get back from Greece, but most of you would have said, well, why wouldn't you have stayed? But no, there are other things to be done. But we're delighted that Professor Putnam is still able to join us, although there is a slight irony here about this social connection, and has been done online via live broadcast from Boston. But that perhaps underlines one of the issues that we all have to face, and certainly have been facing, and the sort of how it's put into stark relationship through COVID is the ability to, where it made real change possible and advanced our ability to stay in touch, and on others, the downside of that particular technology and how it sort of separated us a bit more. But Professor Putnam, of course, is the Malkin Research Professor of Public Policy at Harvard University. And he is one of the most influential social scientists. So he's been thinking about this for a lot longer than most of us. And his groundbreaking research has largely transformed global understanding of the role and importance of social capital. That's the invisible but essential networks of trust and connection that shape our lives and our communities. Something that was very difficult to define, probably still is, but this is a real attempt to make that definition more acceptable. Now, he's, of course, written an awful lot in that time, from Bowling Alone to the Upswing. Professor Putnam's books have provided those profound insights into the decline of what I suppose we would call civic life, and crucially, how we might go about rebuilding that. In fact, what we understood as civic life and how we might rebuild that. The RSA, I feel, has always understood that social infrastructure is just as vital as the physical infrastructure, and that strong communities built on relationships and the mutual support are fundamental to tackling all sorts of things that affect people's lives, and whether that's inequality, improving well-being, and creating opportunities for all. The Revealing Social Capital research program, which you'll probably hear more about this evening, is a significant step in this effort, exploring how social connections influence life outcomes across education, employment, health, and that social mobility. Now, we've just been hearing why this work could not be more important, and I think all of you have slightly different ideas of why it is so important, but it is, especially if it's really true that 1 in 20 people today in the UK say they have no close friends at all. Levels of trust, whether that's neighbours, institutions, or actually each other, have declined dramatically. Now, how much of this is our inability to cope with the impact of the internet, World Wide Web, IT, artificial intelligence, social media? Who knows, but perhaps the professor has a better answer than I would have to those questions. We see the effects in all sorts of different ways, and particularly on the communities that kind of feel left behind. But as Professor Putnam's research shows, history tells us that change is possible and it's constant. And societies have faced similar crises before, and they have certainly turned the tide, but you could argue that it's a circular system which seems to go on and people react to it. But this work certainly aligns directly with the RSA's mission to create a world where everyone can participate, contribute, and thrive. And that's important, and I hope the presence of so many people here and online listening in rather shows that there is a real interest in how we translate that into our lives. And I hope very much that this evening's discussion will inspire us all to think about how we can strengthen the social fabric that underpins our communities and ensure that everyone, wherever they come from, has the connections they need to flourish as individuals. So thank you for joining us, and please join me in welcoming Professor Robert Putnam.
Thank you, Your Royal Highness, for those fulsome remarks. And thanks also to the RSA for hosting this event. I should say also that there's much overlap in what I'm going to say with what Andy Haldane said last month in the RSA CEO's lecture. Therefore, much of tonight is going to be Putnam agreeing with Haldane, agreeing with Putnam, and therefore critical comments from panelists and the audience will be especially important. So let's take the next slide. I'm going to be talking about the state of American democracy today. I obviously know a lot about Britain. My wife and family and I have spent many years in Britain, but I'm going to be talking here in the first instance entirely about America. Let's have the next slide, please. And I'm going to begin with the American national election of last November. Despite what you will hear from other people, especially the Trump administration, our last national election was entirely normal. It was not exceptional in any regard. First of all, despite the Trump claims, 2024 was not a classic landslide. A landslide would be something like FDR winning by 24% in 1936 and cementing the New Deal, or LBJ winning by nearly 23% in 1964, which led to the Great Society and Medicare and Medicaid and civil rights bills, or even Reagan, who won by 18%, ushering in the Reagan Revolution. By comparison, Trump won by 1.5%. This was not a classic landslide. And second, the key issue, all commentators and analysts agree, the key issue in this 2024 election was economics, and elections are almost always about the economy, stupid. Whenever the economy turns, as it does now, as it often does, and it is now turning, the political pendulum reverses. Next slide, please. So it was a normal election, but in a deeper sense, it is true that the 2024 election was a major signpost historically. First of all, Trump did not create the polarized, atomized, unequal America that we're now living in. He exploited. He was a consequence of that. And you don't need to trust me. Steve Bannon and J.D. Vance have also both said that that when they were trying to work out Trump's political strategy back in the day in 2016, they read Bowling Alone and they said, this guy at Harvard has come up with an idea about declining social capital, and that means that our strategy for rousing a authoritarian populist movement should focus on the places that Putnam discovered had low social capital. And in fact, empirical research now confirms that low social capital led directly to the Trump vote. And therefore, in that deeper sense, the historical threat illustrated by Trump, not caused by Trump, but illustrated by Trump, goes on. And the real historical threat revealed by the most recent election is growing social isolation and a growing class gap. And both of those have been shown in two recent works of mine. So I'm going to now shift a little bit to just summarize what my own research says about how we got in this pickle. Next slide, please. The first part of this is drawn from a book that I published together with Shane and Romney Garrett called The Upswing: How America Came Together a Century Ago and How We Can Do It Again. Next slide, please. This book begins by showing empirically that America is today at historic levels of four different maladies. Political polarization. As I will show in a minute, America's politics have rarely been as polarized as they are today. Economic inequality. America has probably never been as unequal economically as we are today. We're a little bit, measures of social isolation are a little bit less rigorous over long periods of time, but it's still true that it's probably the case that rarely has Americans been so socially isolated. And finally, cultural self-centeredness. So the next part of these slides is going to try to say, well, how did we get to this pickle? Next slide, please. Sorry, pickle I'm told, is a purely mid-century, middle of America term. But being in a pickle means you're in a tough shape. So all the next 4 or 5 graphs are all going to have the same shape. So dimensions. So I'm going to show you a little bit on this. The horizontal axis here runs from over at the left-hand side about the end of the 19th century, about 1890, 1895, and ends up in about 2015. Actually, we've been keeping track since the book was published. We've been keeping track, and the polarization has continued. So if we had the full up-to-date graph into 2025, it would show actually the lower right-hand graph going even further. And the only period in American history, which it's close, but the only period in American history which has been as polarized as we are today is a period between 1860 and 1865. Those of you who are familiar with American history know that means the Civil War. So we are really very polarized. And now, how about the vertical axis? Vertical up is a period in American history when we're getting along, and down is polarized here. So you can see now, looking at the graph, I'm not going to behind each of these graphs there are thousands of data points, but I'm not. This is not a methodological exercise, so I'm not going to be going through how exactly we produce these charts. But as you can see, over at the end of the 19th century, American politics were really tribal, very polarized, almost no cooperation across party lines. But then as the 20th century opened, we began to get a little more cooperative across party lines. Not very cooperative, but still more. But significantly, that kept going up and up and up. It rose before World War II, and it rose after World War II. And in the middle of the 20th century, it reached its peak around in the middle 50s, which happens to have been the period of the Eisenhower presidency. Eisenhower was the least polarized president in American history, except for George Washington. But Eisenhower was the consequence, the symptom of the polarization, not the cause. And we continued to be relatively not polarized. People worked across party lines into the 70s and even the early 80s, but then suddenly the trend reversed and we became more and more polarized, down, down, down. And as I said, it just keeps going down. It is still going down. Let's have the next slide now. The next slide shows trends in economic equality. And again, this is measured in many different ways. It's measured in the gap between rich and poor. It's measured in terms of income inequality, in terms of wealth equality, in terms of wealth and income, and before and after taxes, and in terms of upward mobility. So this is a quite comprehensive measure, and all of the various components of it show the same picture. And you can see, well, the data here begins, strictly speaking, in 1914, which is when the Internal Revenue Service was created, and that's when we have really hard data, but we have pretty good data beforehand. And in the late 1990s and early 1900s, it was what was called then and still is called the Gilded Age. The gap between rich and poor was enormous. But then you could see in the beginning of the 20th century that began to change. Still pretty unequal, but it began to change. You see that dip there during the 1920s. That was a period of the Roaring 20s, both in the UK and in the US. So stock markets were going up, unemployment was going up, and therefore inequality went down. But then even before the crash, the American economy began to be less and more equal. And even before FDR took office in 1932, we had already begun to become a little more equal, and it kept going up. Obviously, the World War II had some effect, but even after World War II, we were increasingly cooperative with, equal. The gap between rich and poor in the 1950s and 1960s was quite low. Indeed, this will maybe shock you. In that period, at the late 1950s, there were two countries in the world which were this equal: America, capitalist America, and socialist Sweden. It's a true fact. We were unbelievably equal. Exceeded only by capitalist Sweden and not by capitalist Norway or Denmark or anybody. We were really equal. in the middle of the 20th century, but then that turned, and now it's getting boring. We had every year less and less equality. Pardon me. Every year the gap between rich and poor grew. It looks here in the Obama years, in the middle of the 2010s, it looked like that was finally leveling off, but no, once it becomes the Trump years, the gap between rich and poor grows even more rapidly. And now, as I said before, we're down well below. I mean, I think it's probably true that America has never been so unequal as we are today in economic terms. Let's have the next slide, please. The next slide is a measure of what I here call social capital, but social cohesion, but you all know as social capital. And I won't go through in detail about how we measure this because Andy has gone on at great length about how to measure it, but it's things like, do you belong to groups? Do you trust your neighbors? Do you get married? All sorts of measures of togetherness or social cohesion. Now the graph is looking very familiar. At the end of the 19th century, Americans were very socially isolated. That's because that was the height of our industrial revolution, and lots of people had moved from the farms to the cities, the farms in Iowa or the farms in Sicily, and they didn't have friends or have connections in their new homes. But then, as you can see, again, beginning in the early 19 teens, that began to improve. And once again, we can see the pause during the 1920s, but and I don't actually have an explanation for that pause, but beginning in the 1930s, every year, more and more friends, more and more marriages, more and more kids, more and more social trust, more and more belonging to groups. And in the middle 1960s, by the way, I should say that I actually came of age I was born in 1941, so in 1961 I was 20 years old, and I actually began voting just at the peak of this curve. It's possible that by starting to vote, I may have inadvertently caused the collapse of American civilization, but we want to look at other possible explanations for that decline, but the decline is actually almost linear. Every year, fewer club meetings, less trust in neighbors, every measure goes down, down, down. And once again, if we kept that chart running until 2025, it turns out it's still going down. Let's have the last slide, please. This is a measure of cultural solidarity. I wish I had time here to go through the ways we measured it, because I'm rather proud of the methodological ways in which we measured the degree of cultural solidarity. This is not a methodological exercise, but so I will just say quickly, down at the beginning of the 20th century, Americans were very much focused on themselves. And that rose gradually from the beginning of the 20th century to the middle of the 20th century. And by the middle of the 20th century, Americans were all about we. We thought that we were all in this together, not every person on their own. But then again, once again, in the middle of the 60s, that turns and goes the other direction. And by now, we're back down into this extremely self-centered period. Now, if we have the next slide, I'm going to put these four graphs I've shown you together. I'm not going to explain it all, except it turns out these graphs are all so closely correlated that this one chart summarizes much of what happened to America in economics, politics, society, and culture from the late 19th century until the early years of the 21st century. That's what we call the we-I century. We were a collection of I's, then we became a we in the middle of the century, and now we're back to being unequal, politically divided, socially isolated, and focused on me. Next slide, please. And this one, I want to show here just one slide that indicates how the degree to which this increase in social isolation is not evenly spread across all Americans. There's a growing class divide in how many friends people have. And this graph on the left-hand side, it shows how many people with a bachelor's degree or higher, that is, people who have gone to college, graduated from college, or on the other hand, people who've only gone through high school. And you can see the social isolation is much more concentrated among working class Americans, and having lots of friends is even well-educated people have fewer friends than they did, but nothing like the drop from 49% having 6 close friends to 17% having 6 close friends. So let's go to the next slide, please. Here's the bottom line of our democratic crisis are, first of all, a shriveled sense of we. That's sort of illustrated in all the slides I've shown. Secondly, class-based social isolation. And again, I've just shown you some of the multitude of evidence that shows that. And finally, it's not just about economics. And this is a point I want to emphasize as I come to the close now. The reason that working class people voted in such large degrees for Trump and voted against Democrats last time was not just inflation or not just economics. It was about the fact that upper class people like me, I mean, well-educated people, like the Democrats who've run for office, simply refused to recognize that we didn't even see the 2/3 of America who are not as well educated as we. Let's go to the next slide. And I am getting very close to the end here. I want to go back just for a second to this IWI graph. Many people looking at this graph, their eyes are focused on the middle of it, what happened in the 1960s, they would say. And there is an interesting debate to be had about what happened in the 1960s to cause that downturn. But the relevant part of the graph that I want to focus on is the lower left-hand side, because that's the period in American history that is most like our period. To put it in a nutshell, folks, some Americans at least, back in the 1890s and around 1900, must have done something right, because after that, for 2/3 of a century, we went steadily upward. And therefore, that's what we need to do now. What we need to do now is to ask, what did they do? That era happens to become called a progressive era in American history. And so the question and we turn to the next slide, the question is, what are the 4 lessons from America's last upswing? The first, I have to say, and I'm happy to talk more about this later, the we that was created in the progressive era wasn't inclusive enough. Most especially, it was not racially inclusive enough. And therefore, if, as I hope, we move toward a new upswing in the 21st century, this time we're going to have to be really careful that we is not just a white we, or even worse, a white male we, but a we that encompasses all Americans. Second lesson from that last upswing is that the people who led the movement were not old folks like me. They were young people. For example, one of the leaders of it was the creator of Hull House, a settlement house in America that she had brought the idea actually from London to Chicago. And I'm blanking for a moment on her name. Jane Addams. Jane Addams. Yeah, Jane Addams. Fortunately, I've got a person just off screen here who knows that I need help, reminders from time to time. We're familiar with a picture of Jane Addams, an old lady getting the Nobel Prize sometime in the 1930s for her work in the progressive era. But the fact is she was getting that honor because of work she had done when she was in her 20s. And virtually all of the really interesting ideas that came out of the progressive era were created by young people. That was true then, and it will be true again. Old people like me have lived long enough to know that it doesn't have to be like this. But old people like me don't have the kind of mind or the kind of experience that will work for creating new forms of social capital that, in the middle of the 21st century. Third point, it was a bottom up. That trend was bottom up. I'm going to be hopeful that it will be bottom up this time. I wish I had more time to give you some examples of how extraordinary things that changed America and eventually changed the world were ideas that were first created in fly over America, in the small villages of middle America, that's where the innovations came mostly from. Last point, and this is in a way the most surprising, and I'm going to end with this point. It was, if you look at all of those variables in all of those graphs that I've showed you, they're all highly well measured. And so you would think, well, okay, let's just, do an econometric analysis and find what the leading variable is. And I thought for sure we would know what the leading variable is. I thought for sure it was economics. Turns out the only thing we can be sure of is that economics was the last to turn. I'm not saying economic inequality is not important. I'm saying the last time around, it was the last thing to change. Economics did not lead the last time, and it won't lead this time. What led last time actually turns out to be morals. There was a moral and cultural shift the last time. And I'm delighted in the Q&A to talk about what my evidence for that is, but in effect, Americans, especially young Americans, at the turn of the last century, looked around and said, young, well-off Americans said, we're doing fine, but lots of other Americans aren't. They began to focus on their moral obligations to other Americans, especially have-not Americans. And that was the first thing that led. In short, a bunch of young people, themselves well-educated and well-off, came to think that they had obligations to other people, and especially to have-nots. And they led the cultural shift, which in turn led to political changes and eventually led to changes in our economic equality. Next slide, please. And this is what I'm concluding about. I really want to emphasize this, especially in this setting. And I'm not sure whether Andy knew when he invited me that I was going to turn out to be, of course, I think economics is really important, but I think what the evidence says to me is that culture is at least as important as economics in two different senses. First of all, the central problem is cultural. That is, educated progressives like me looking down their noses at what Hillary Clinton, against my advice, called the deplorables. But if I'm correct, it's not just that the central problem is cultural, it's that the central cause of the problem is cultural. It is our, and I'm talking about well-educated Democrats like me, well-educated progressives, it is our disrespecting and not recognizing the problems of the lower two-thirds of American society. Can we have the next slide, please? And I'm going to close with two quotes. This is one that's only a couple of weeks old. Elon Musk, who's great for saying things that you can't imagine any person saying, the fundamental weakness of Western civilization is empathy. In other words, what's basically wrong is we care for other people. That's the dominant view among America's leaders today. But let's go to the last slide, which is what we really need. The leader of the last progressive movement, President Theodore Roosevelt, also a Republican, as it turns out, said the fundamental rule of our national life, the fundamental rule of our national life, is not that we should be selfish. It is the rule that underlines all the others is that on the whole and in the long run, we go up or down together. Thank you very much for listening.
Victoria, on phone. Yeah, is that right? Sarah.
I've told to go there.
Nick's on the far left.
As if.
First of all, thank you, Bob, for an absolutely wonderful lecture, and thank you for bridging through the technical glitches at the beginning. Listen, we've got a fantastic panel. Let me introduce them very briefly before I turn to them for some comments. Firstly, to my direct left, Sarah Heminger, founder and CEO of a fantastic not-for-profit called Thread in Baltimore, which you'll hear more about in a second. And Sarah's also leading our work in Baltimore as part of RSA US. And then to Sarah's left, Marnie Freeman, co-founder and director of Neighborly Labs, who've been one of our fantastic partners on the Revealing Social Capital project, about which Marnie will be saying more in a second. And finally, to Marnie's left, Sir Nick Clegg, President of Global Affairs at Meta until around May, I think, Nick, give or take. And formerly, of course, Deputy Prime Minister and leader of the Liberal Democratic Party. Let me turn to the panel and take some reflections on Bob's wonderful tour de force lecture, starting, if I could, with Sarah. Thoughts from you?
Well, good evening. It is truly an honor to be with all of you. You know, I think the bell curve is interesting in that there's two other things that happen in the United States that are represented on that curve, or on those curves. The first is the formation of the American high school, which happened early in the 20th century. And the second is Brown versus Board of Education, which happened in 1954, which was intended, it was 5 legal cases, but that were intended to desegregate our schools. The challenge is that what actually happened is we really had not done the inner work, the intrapersonal work, or the interpersonal work of bridging and bonding. We hadn't built the will, let alone the skill. And so in cities like Baltimore, you had white flight out of the cities, followed by middle-class black flight. And so when you look at our 2 historically black high schools in Baltimore today, Douglas and Dunbar, they're actually more segregated than they were in 1954 because they're segregated both by race and by class. And so when we think about Rashedi's work showing that the relationship between economic connectedness and economic mobility, we've essentially extracted from our communities the one lever that actually can lead to more just outcomes across the board. And so when we think about what is our work at Thread, what we do is we enroll high school freshmen who are academically in the bottom of their class. So the average incoming GPA is 0.73 on a 4.0 scale. They are exceptional individuals, but they are in extraordinary situations, facing all kinds of barriers, both in and out of school. And then the radical thing that we do is we commit to them for 10 years. And we never unenroll a young person. So during that time, we take a place-based approach where they're matched with up to 4 adults who live, work, or go to school near them. And the idea is that they do life together. That could be giving the high school student a ride to school, packing their lunch. It could be going to an Orioles game. If you would do it with your own child, we do it with ours. And what we've seen over the last 2 decades of building community in this way is outcomes that are off the charts. So in Baltimore City, for young people who have GPAs of less than 1.0, so remembering our young people, the average is 0.73, only 6% complete high school in 4 years. In Thread, keeping in mind that we never unenroll a single young person, 65% of our young people complete high school, and sometimes it takes 4 years, 5 years, 6 years, 7. But they do it, and they go on to build lives. They go on to post-secondary pathways of entrepreneurship. They go into the military, the workforce, onto college. Many of them are now my colleagues at Thread or sit on our board as my bosses. And I'll just give one quick, story to kind of illustrate the 2 things we've learned that are maybe take-homes. The first is that the quantity of connection matters. So just literally, the count of touch points between a young person in Thread and those 4 adults that they're matched with in a given month allows us to predict if they are going to complete high school on time. So it's just simple. Think of like how you would look at dollars in a corporation. That's how we look at touch points inside of our community. The second is the quality of connection matters. So it's not just giving a young person a ride to school, but what we've learned is that after so many rides to school, both individuals start describing feeling very known, very seen. If you ask them further out in time, what happens is the young person starts describing the adult asking for their help. It might be they had an argument with their spouse that morning, or they're struggling at work or at school themselves. And it's in asking for help that there starts to be this fundamental shift in identity. And so to me, my background is as a computational neuroscientist, like that makes sense. Like we're hardwired to want to be helpers. We get dopamine and oxytocin and serotonin, and our cortisol goes down. And yet our young people are told they're disadvantaged, they're at risk, they're disenfranchised, all these things that basically say you're only to be helped, you're never to be the helper. And so when we think about like who are the haves and who are the have-nots, part of the cultural shift that I think Bob is really referring to, the moral shift, is the genuine acknowledgement, not just that each human being matters, but that we actually need each other. And it's figuring out how do we have space and place to really message that in our words and in our actions.
Wonderful, Sarah. Thank you for the nodding heads in the room. I can see it. Marnie, talk us through some of the UK work that you've been working on.
Well, thank you. Well, before I start, I'd love a quick show of hands. I'd love to understand for you, in terms of thinking of the settings where social connections happen and form, how many of you are friends with people from secondary school? Fantastic. How many of you are friends with some of your neighbours? Okay. And how many of you who may be a part of a hobby or recreation group have friends through them? Thank you, you're in the right place. I'd love also for you to think, without showing hands now, of those social connections, how many of them do you think are across lines of economic difference, which was the work that we were looking at? So, thank you. So in thinking about that, we were lucky to be part of a wide research team with RSA, BIT, Meta, Stripe partners, where we were looking at bringing to life the data from Meta, understanding the relationship between economic connectedness and people's well-being and their social mobility. The qualitative team, the Neighbourly Lab team, went out and about to 4 locations across the UK to understand what was really going on, what was really happening in communities that had either really high and good economic connectedness across lines of difference, or not very good and low. And we went and we spoke to lots of residents in many places through the winter, walking about, understanding what was going on. And we did see that there was lots of examples of social capital in many places. There were some examples of crossing lines of economic difference with social and well-being benefits, and there were some that led to social mobility. So thinking about that made us think, well, what are the settings and conditions for that upswing that Bob optimistically says that we can potentially have, things that we could leverage? What are those green shoots that will enable the people in this room and beyond to start thinking about changing our communities? How can we build that vibrant social connection? Is it the infrastructure? Is it with the residents? Is it doing that bottom-up, co-produced type of work? Is it investment? Is it policy? Is it a mix of all of these things? So why was there social capital in some places and economic connectedness in some of these places, but actually in other places there was absolutely nothing, but everything else was similar? So we spoke to the residents and we spent time in their community centres, their leisure centres, their libraries, their cafes, their pubs. A lot of time was spent in some of their pubs trying to understand what was going on. And to give some examples, we saw that, like the quant data, it mirrored it really clearly, that there were 2 really good, strong settings where this happened. It took place in employment and the workplace, and hobbies and activities and sports groups. So thinking about that, for example, in Sturchley in Birmingham, where there was the Cadbury factory and Land Rover, they invested really strongly in their community. They invested in a much more culturally equal organisation. They invested in bringing together people across the organisation and mixing them so that if you were a cleaner or you were the director, you would work together in these, you would play together in these spaces, you would go out for drinks, you would mix and meet so that there was much more mixing and economic connectedness. So for example, we met a woman whose husband worked in the factory in Cadbury, and he started life out in the pub, but met the director, got friendly, got a job, and eventually worked his way up, and then continued to do that within the community himself. We saw the same in Massam in the north. last week, where there are breweries and mills that involve themselves not just in employing the local community, but investing in the community. They've sponsored the triathlons, they get involved in the town square, in local markets, they employ local people, and they bring about social change that brings people together, not just through work. So it's a cultural shift as well as investing economically. Then we looked at social, the social fabric, what was going on there with the music, the culture, the arts, and those settings, what was happening with sports. And we saw that a few things were really important. It was around specificity, that was around inclusivity, and also around the information sharing. So those are the shoots that we can really harness to think about what next.
Marnie did a wonderful job, masterful job there actually, of summarising what's 18 months of research with a coalition of partners. For those interested in more, there's an online version, written version of that that's available for bedtime reading this evening. So Nick, Meta's been a wonderful partner in this research and in US research on a similar topic by Raj Chetty. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what you've heard so far from Bob and others.
Well, first, I'm just so delighted that some of these sort of treasure troves of data are being put to good, research use. One of the things that I discovered when I turned up at Silicon Valley, almost 7 years ago, was partly because of recent events in that period of time, but there was just this huge reluctance to use these very, very versatile data sets for, to really look into, particularly some of the claims and counterclaims about what these technologies were doing societally. Anyway, I sort of got the ball rolling, myself and others, to try and change that. There was a very big project with about 11 US universities during the 2020 election. We had very large groups of people, 200, 300,000 people who were using social media, Meta's apps. And for, let's say, 200,000, that test control group, there would be no virality, or the other one there'd be no distribution, the other one there'd be no algorithmic ranking, to sort of try and work out what effect those changes would have on subsequent political behaviour. The independently published papers so far have suggested somewhat underwhelmingly that it basically seems to make very little difference to political behaviour. But it was then it was an important stepping stone, because it got the lawyers and others a little bit more relaxed about using these data sets. So when Raj Chetty and I first started talking about this, it took months and months and months, but we finally got that work done in the US. And then with the help of many people in this room, we sort of obviously now, and with the partnership with Marnie and so many other organisations, we've been able to duplicate that in the UK. So I just hope it serves as a model, because I think the more these big tech companies can become partners and friends of high quality research, the better. The second observation I'd make is one of the things I've learned in the time I've been in Silicon Valley is there are two sets of people I came to trust less and less and less when they made assertions about the role of technology in society. It was the most ardent advocates of technology and the most ardent critics of technology, because they both make the same error. They wildly overstate the deterministic nature of technology in human life. And in one sort of well-researched area after the next, and in fact, Bob Putnam's excellent, I graphs are just another illustration of it. It was Bob's voting habits in 1960, not Facebook, that turned the curve on polarization. But sort of facetiousness and joking aside, I do think, because we've been societally through this, and we're still through it, we're still going through it, we've been through these almost violent mood swings of sort of ludicrous, naive euphoria about social media in the early days, and these new communication technologies in the age of the Arab Spring. It was going to spread democracy, everyone was going to be happy, the traffic was going to flow, the sun was going to shine. Then it, of course, swung the other way, and everything from a referendum or election result you don't like, or an unhappy person, everything gets ascribed to something which is called the algorithm, as if it's got some sort of ability to burrow into our neural pathways and make us feel. And None of the evidence suggests that's true. No, all the evidence suggests that human beings are way more complicated than that technology plays a role, but it is a role often actually outweighed by far, far more, whether it's moral, whether it's cultural, whether it's economic, whether it's historical forces, much of which I think are borne out by Bob Putnam's lecture today. And I don't say this, and of course it's terribly dangerous for me to say this. It sounds like I'm sort of trying to absolve these big technology companies of the responsibility that they rightly should bear, and there are all sorts of fraught issues. I would, however, just because I think it's so crystal clear from Bob's presentation, just dwell on the fact that it's sometimes comforting to think there's a switch you can flick, there's an algorithm you can tweak and all will be well. There's no evidence at all that that is the case, and I think it is way, way more complex than that, and it's so refreshing to hear Bob put that case again so compellingly this evening. The third thing I would just observe in this study that you talk about, Andy, which is available to all of you this evening, it's really fascinating to see the similarities and differences between the data that this study has revealed in the UK and the US. There's some similarities of social isolation, of the driving importance of the connections that people have across income groups. It does appear to be an incredibly powerful catalyst for social mobility, in fact way more than some educational economic factors, which I found very striking when I first read Raj and his team's early US results. But the differences are so interesting. Firstly, thankfully, in the UK we still have much, much higher, which is interesting given what a sort of class-addled society we are. We have much, much higher rates of connection between people of lower and higher income than you do across the United States. Secondly, how geographically dependent it is. So you just see big differences in the connections between people from lower and higher income groups in London and around London compared to other parts of the country. Big questions to ask about that. But also the nature of those connections. We were talking about it earlier, weren't we? In the US, you had a lot of faith-based organizations which seem to be really important venues for that kind of connection, whereas in this somewhat perhaps more godless country of ours, it's sports. And we're a country of hobbyists, so it's knitting rather than God that seems to be the driver of social connection across income groups in the United Kingdom, which again is fascinating and needs to be fostered. But understanding those things, to Bob's point, and it's my final observation, is also crucial for local decision makers, for social innovators, for politicians and for governments to understand what levers to pull, what things to support, because they're not all equal. Some just seem to deliver much more bangs for their bucks than others.
In a second, I'm going to go to the audience for some questions, so get primed on that. Before I do that, let me lob one to the panel to pick up. So, from what you've all said, and indeed from Bob's earlier work, there's a broadly shared diagnosis of what's going on here. The evidence is absolutely compelling. And the question I have, I'll go down the panel starting with Bob, is why is this not at the top of the inbox of our political leaders? And what might we do, Bob, to put it towards the top of the inbox of our political leaders? Bob, do you want to kick us off on that?
Can I just go directly to this question of the relevant role of religion and moralism in America and the faith-based connections and so on, as contrasted with England? Because I know that I've lived in England long enough to know how odd it is to talk about religion or even morality. But I want to refer back to an earlier period. I'm not talking about sexual morality here at all. I'm not talking about sexual morality. I'm talking about the simple morality, as in, do you worry about other people? And what I want to remind you of, and I'm sure you have this all in mind, is the importance of social morality in the mid and late Victorian social reforms. Think of how many of the mid-Victorian social reforms came directly out of a sense of moral obligation, beginning with slavery. Of course, that was even earlier in that period. But Wilberforce was not driven by economic interest. He was driven by a sense of obligation. And exploitation of all forms, child labor, prisons. Think of the role that Charles Dickens' novels played in stimulating popular understanding. and revulsion against inequality. So I guess the one thing I want to make really to Nick, and to, by the way, Nick, you may not remember, we actually met while you were Deputy Prime Minister, and I'm glad to see you again, at least see you virtually. Andy, that's, I guess, the main point that I would make. How do we get national leaders to take this seriously? Well, I'm doing my best. There was a set of national leaders who paid a lot of attention to what I thought. They happen not, you will have noticed, I don't have a lot of clout in Washington today. Actually, I don't know anybody who has a lot of clout in Washington today.
Wonderful. Bob, thank you for that. Sarah, follow that.
I'll try to answer the first question. So I'll just share an example of two humans that I find to be, they illustrate what it looks like to get this right. So I'll change their names for the purposes of privacy. So we'll say Eileen. So Eileen, at the time, was in her late 70s and had joined Thread as a volunteer, and it was March of 2020. And she was paired with a young person who was a freshman in high school, Alice, and they never got to meet because the world shut down. And so Eileen would text Alice every single day and say, I'm here, I want to support you, what's happening with you and your family during COVID, and there would be no response. So months of texting, sometimes multiple times a day with no response. So the first part of, if we understand, here's the symptoms, here's the diagnosis, and the treatment plan is connection, why aren't we doing it? Because it's hard. And it's especially hard if you're trying to do it across lines of difference. It's hard to text someone every day for months and not get a response. So what happened in this circumstance was that Eileen had a heart attack. It was her third heart attack, and she was in the hospital. So she texted Alice. She said, I'm so sorry, I haven't texted for a few days. I had a heart attack. What do you think happened next? Alice is at the hospital standing outside in the middle of a global pandemic trying to figure out how to get to her room. So it's that moment of feeling like I'm needed, I can help. And so it was this high school student who then helped Eileen to recuperate from her heart attack, to get home, to get settled, to become well. And then that fall, it was Eileen picking up Alice from her house, bringing her back home, and basically setting up a pod where she was able to Zoom and go to school, sometimes with her friends coming over. And then Alice ended up graduating from high school on time. And so it's just all of the things that have to prove true in that situation. There's a resilience that's required. There's a tolerance of imperfection. There's a willingness to be patient and not let a sense of urgency drive the situation. And so I think relationships are hard and they're really messy. And what's required, what's required is just to not give up and to stay persistent and to show someone that you're there. And then eventually, that connection happens. I think, to your point, I'd never thought of this until listening to you just now. Maybe we've gotten to the point where technology is actually like food, that it's necessary to live, but it's how you consume it, and it's how you modulate your view and your relationship to it. And I think about the ways in which technology is such a powerful tool for connection, and how it can also be one that causes disconnection. And so I think it's here, we need it. It's a source of sustenance. It's just how do we engage it and how do we utilize it in each of our lives? And I think, so from a policy perspective, answering maybe that question, maybe thinking about it in the same ways we regulate food, I don't know.
Thank you, Sarah. Barney.
To echo Sarah's words, it's hard, it's really hard, and it's difficult to measure, and they don't know how to measure social connection, because is it relational? Is it looking at longer term outcomes? And there's nobody to look at longer term outcomes. You need to be in power for a long time, and we change over and things change, and it's really difficult to keep that level of interest We were looking at loneliness for a very long time, and now the narrative's changing to social connection, but ultimately it's looking at the same thing. We want to understand how to support communities to connect better. Another reason I think that is looking at the social infrastructure, and where from going out and about in all these communities and understanding what's there, but also fundamentally what's missing. It's very hard to measure what's not there. So it's actually looking at what do we need to do to build back and build it together, and that it's expensive as well. There's a lot that needs to be invested in places, and then invested in people, in communities, to do the work, to connect with each other, to do that outreach, and to say to other people, we're welcoming you, it's okay, you can come out now, and let's build this thing together. What do you want? What do you need? People don't know, but they know when you ask them.
Marnie, thank you. And finally, Nick, as someone who's been a political leader, what would it take, Nick, to get this as to lift off?
Well, first, of course, politicians are incentivized by winning votes, and they win votes in short, as you just said, Marnie, in very short sort of cycles. So these long-term issues just is misaligned with the political incentives. You can't blame the politicians for that. That's what they're in a sense just responding to the way that they're kind of set up to act. Having said all of that, you do get these rare moments. I was in Austin, Texas the week before last. Went and just popped in to see by the way, if any of you were there, go to see the LBJ library or museum. It really is an extraordinary tribute to the man, but also to this very unusual combination of ruthless political guile with sort of moral leadership. I mean, he was both appalling and extraordinarily inspiring in almost equal measure. And it's really interesting, if you're interested in politics and of someone trying to do good, but doing good through bare-knuckle political methods, it's that's a man who knew how to count, he knew how to kind of get those votes in Congress. And so but also what he did, which certainly I found very striking as I sort of went through the library, the museum, is, of course, he allied it, which is what all great politics is, what all great politicians succeed in doing, is he didn't introduce a series of measures, he didn't introduce a series of policies, he told a story. He told a story of where America was, or had been, where it came from, where it was, and where it wanted to go, the Great Society, and so on. And certainly Bob called it shriveled. My much more shriveled experience in politics was one of the many things that I realized with hindsight I got wrong was I would spend so much time delivering individual initiatives and forgetting that unless you tell a story in politics, you're not going to, some of the things that I tried to do in government with people like Polly Mackenzie and others work squarely in the tradition of trying to promote social mobility. The pupil premium, a radical shift in trying to funnel funding to the kids who need it most in school. Universal free school meals, which we introduced, which I read in the papers today, Labour's apparently going to get rid of. Apparently when they do it, it's not called austerity, but when we did it is. But anyway, that's a little aside there. But what I realised, and then I asked myself, why were those policies, it's one of them now, if I understand it, being unwound by a Labour government, the other one was being unwound by a Conservative government. Both of them really good policies. All the evidence show they really promote fairness. And I think one of the things I felt was, we didn't tell a story about them. And I think modern politicians are no different to politicians in the LBJ era. If you want to deliver transformational change, you've got to tell a story about where the country is, and where you want it to go. And if you don't do that, all the amount of research and individual policy wonkery in places like this won't get you anywhere unless you tell a good story.
Wonderful. Let's get the audience. We're at a little bit of time. Let's collect some questions in... There's a roving mic. Wait for the mic so we all hear your excellent question. And try keep it as a question rather than a speech. And on topic, even better. Let's start here and then we'll go down the front.
Yeah, hello. My name's Sasha. I work up in Hartlepool in a small estate-based charity. I just wonder, I've heard a lot and I've been here today, and I just wonder, is there space or should there be more space for love in these conversations? We don't talk about love, and actually the people from Thread, you're not telling me they don't love them kids, because they will. We just don't use the word. So I wonder, how do we bring love into this conversation in a way which is meaningful?
Wonderful. Let's go down. We'll collect 3 questions and then go back to the audience. We'll go down here. Sorry, I'm making the... Yeah, Karen, just wait for the mic, Karen. And then we'll go.
Thank you very much, Professor, and to the panel. I went to a refresher in January 2017, Professor Rabi Abdullah at Harvard Business School, HBS, and he did a diagnosis of Brexit and Trump the year before on the fault lines, and they were identical. And he closed the lecture with a graph. And like your bell curves, you started at the end of the Civil War and the beginning of the Gilded Age. He started at the end of the Battle of Waterloo, where globalization was 0, went up to 1900, globalization peaked, and then the First World War, Second World War crashed. Then he went from 1945, and globalization went up and peaked in 2017. And he said, if history repeats itself, we're going to have conflict. So where's the comparison between what you studied in America with individuals and on this global basis, where on the one extreme we could be headed for a third world war?
Thank you, Karen. Sobering question there. Let's take one more here, and then we'll go back to the panel.
Thank you. My name is Tom Schuller. Thanks, Bob, for the lecture. You may remember at OECD you came to help us introduce social capital into that organization for a while. But my question or challenge to you is on the youth dimension. I'm not sure if you were attributing this historically or whether you're saying this is the case today, that you expect it to be youth-led. And my question is, why are you discarding the potential of intergenerational bridging social capital, which seems to me really important? And of course that's a sort of prejudice plea because I'm in that older generation. But it just seems to me, if you leave it with youth, or if you say that's what we should look to, you're ignoring a huge potential of social interaction.
Thank you. One more question, and then we'll go back to the panel.
Yeah, hi, thank you. I'm Amanda Askin from Ealing Council. I just wondered, and not to disagree with the previous speaker, but I was interested in your first question, Andy, about the inbox of politicians, and thinking actually we've heard from both Bob and Sarah that this has got to be a youth-led movement, and we know the disconnection at the moment between quite a lot of youth and politics. Is there a different way of getting this into a different inbox which would give us that grassroots youth movement that we need for really good social innovation?
4 fantastic questions. If the panelists could keep their answers nice and short, we'll just about fit in another round of questions. So, Bob, can I turn to you first to pick off any of those you fancy, Bob?
I want to focus on this question of youth and the role of youth in age. I certainly agree that it's important to have age bridging. I'm probably the oldest person virtually in the room, in fact. But as it happens, my son is in the room, and my grandson, his son, maybe, I'm not sure whether he's in the room or not. And so let me talk about my role and my grandson's role. His name is Gideon, by the way. I'm old enough. We talk all the time. It's wonderful. We have a very good relationship, as I do with all my grandchildren. My role is to say America doesn't have to be the America that you've always lived in. I remember personally a time when we didn't lock our doors, and they kind of all laugh at me, but that's the role I play. Say it doesn't have to be this way. And then I say, but it's up to you guys, my grandchildren, to figure out what's the next step. What do we do going forward? Because I can't imagine. Well, it probably will involve social media, but maybe not, and probably in unexpected ways, and I don't have the right mindset to be able to figure out what's going to work in 2050. There's more to be said, of course, but I'm going to stop there.
Thank you, Bob. Sarah, Marnie, Nick.
Figure out what's going to work in 2050.
So just to the question about love, if we were to find love as honest recognition of who someone truly is, almost a mirror, there's reciprocity that comes in that. And I think that to the question about young people, there has to be reciprocity in cross-generational relationships that are fully inclusive. I think anytime we shrink the circle we're going to lose getting to 360 degrees in the vantage points that we need to see. I do think one of the beautiful things about young people is they have this ability to be direct with kindness. So when they see something, they say something. There's less of a filter. They've had less time where they've been told, here's how to do it. And there's a rawness and a beauty and authenticity and an honesty to youth that I do think we have to listen to, and that I do think is why there's oftentimes a lot of innovation that comes that way. But I don't think that excludes us, those of us that, I think it just means that, I'll give you a quick example. I had a disagreement with my daughter. We were looking at a sunrise, and I was having this like best moment of my life. My dad had been sick. My whole family went on this trip. We're standing on this cliff, and I kept saying to her, she was 6 at the time, look at the sun, look at the sun, look at the sun. And I kept getting very frustrated with her that she would not listen to me. And I started thinking, she kept saying, no, the moon. And I kept saying, please look at the sun. And I started thinking, does my 6-year-old not know the difference between the sun and the moon? Has COVID gone that badly in our household educationally? And she finally got so frustrated with me that she grabbed my arm and turned me around, and there was the moon. And we were standing at the exact same place on the planet at the exact same time, and we were just facing 180 degrees apart and seeing something so different than the sun and the moon. So regardless of age, I think part of love is just building the habit to, when someone says, I see the moon, turn around before they have to pull your arm.
Lovely. Marnie?
I don't know how to follow that. That was beautiful. That was really lovely. My interpretation of love is thinking about one of these women that I met in Derby Road in Southampton, who I would say she embodied love because she embodied love for her community so much that she was tirelessly working to change things. She didn't intend ever to be a community mobilizer, a community connector. She had the opportunity when she had her baby to go to a children's centre and was lucky enough to meet other women from different backgrounds and think about, you know, and got support and got community and felt a love of other women to support each other. Then they realised that when their children were going to school, they needed to get involved and they needed to do things to love their community, to love the school, to invest in it. So they got involved in the PTA and they helped that. Then the school went a bit difficult and they changed things, and then they decided that actually they needed to do things for their health and their well-being. So they brought in other women, other people from other communities, and set up walking groups and aerobics. And then they set up a local swimming group. And again, Sasha, to your point about love, this was all founded on, we want to build a community, a proper community for our children to grow up in and to support everyone around us. Then they set up a women's swimming group. Then the swimming pool was going to be shut down. So what did they do? They poured their love into activism and they saved the swimming pool. So I do say love is at the heart of it. It doesn't get put on application forms for funding, and it doesn't, you know, can you measure love in these outcomes? No, but it actually is, that is what is motivating us to support our communities to do better and grow stronger. It's at the heart of the culture that Bob was talking about, how we can build things better.
Nick, I think you may well have, given the time, this may well be the last words.
Oh, really? Oh, gosh, I better raise my game then. No, the only thing I was going to add was I think it's sort of buried within a lot of these this conversation. I do think your fundamental attitude towards the future is terribly important. And since we're all sort of drawing on our own experiences, one of the things I found most striking in this sort of, to my mind, somewhat surprising life switch I made from 20 odd years in politics, 12 years as an MP in the House of Commons, to then the sort of bright, shiny, gleaming kind of world of Silicon Valley, was I went from a world which was really suffocated by the past I mean, Westminster is just drowning in the past. It's sort of, it's smothered by it. And we had, as a country, basically, shortly before I left, basically had an argument about the past. Brexit is a triumph of nostalgia over a claim on the future. And then I went to this place where everyone there wasn't any past, because the place looks as if it was built last Tuesday. And everyone's competing with each other about to lay greater claim on the future. And of course it's silly and you can mock it, and a lot of it's wildly hyperbolic and annoying sometimes and so on. But it was a huge culture shift for me. And I remember thinking how important it is to try and foster an environment where you are excited about trying to shape the future. And I sort of felt, for a whole bunch of reasons, that our country had, the best way I can put it, to use the word love, I feel we sort of fell out of love with the future. We just stopped thinking about, we kept arguing about what our past was and whether we should try and repeat it and recapture it and reoccupy it. And I just think we got, and I oddly enough, actually bizarrely think that the events in Washington and the actions of the US government over the last few weeks weirdly and unexpectedly presents this old battered, tattered continent of ours, Europe, a chance to try and reclaim the future again, because we're going to have to do it on our own. We can't rely on Uncle Sam. So I do think, talk about storytelling, talking about loving the future again, I do think there's an odd opportunity for us, which I didn't think was going to be afforded to Europe, given how battered and bruised we are, to try and sort of reassert our own claim on the future. And that is very, very, very powerful. It's a hell of a lot better than spending all your time arguing about your past.
And what a wonderful, inspiring and forward-looking way to end. Listen, we're in overtime, so let's draw things to a close. Let me thank all of you in the room, and I know there are many hundreds online, for joining today, for contributing so actively. I'm sorry we didn't get to more of your questions, but there'll always be a next time, I suspect, on the questions we've been discussing today. Let me thank all of our partners, the RSA's partners, too many to mention, in the work that we've done so far and the work we intend doing in future to build an even stronger platform for change. To all our amazing panelists, to Sarah, to Marnie and to Nick, for their absolutely fabulous, rich stories, big word tonight, and contributions. To our patron, Royal Highness Princess Royal, for coming along, for welcoming us and for inspiring us with your opening talk. And last, but by no means least, the man on the screen peering over us all, Bob Putnam, across the pond. Bob, we'll have to get you across next time. But for this evening, a huge thank you, not just for your lecture, but also for opening all of our eyes to the fundamental importance of these issues of social connection and social capital at this most crucial of times. So on behalf of everyone, please join me in thanking everyone.